With that, actually, let's get started. Nice. Um, well, the first thing I want to talk about with the history lesson, when we're talking about the early East Asian, basically warrior women, you do need to give it some context. First thing I want to talk about is the Shang Dynasty. The Shang Dynasty is the second Chinese dynasty. It was from about 1600 BC to about about 1060 BC. So 3,600 years ago to about 3,000 years ago. This is during the Bronze Age, so there's at the time the technology is not the best. This is going from mid to early Bronze Age into late Bronze Age. Bone tools were still heavily used, bone-based weapons, in wood and stuff like that. Bronze was in stone also. This is a little bit after stone was no longer considered to be the top dog, right? So one thing that's interesting is we're going to talk about the Shang Dynasty. So with some historical context to the Shang Dynasty is a freaking awesome part of Chinese history. Mainly because even though it's not given a ton of credit, for a lot of things that they did, it did have a lot of innovations as far as technology and also even forms of governing. And yes, it was an empire the whole time and a dynasty, but at the same time, there were things where it changed throughout this time. One of these big changes would be let's talk about the Tang Chen, who is the first of the Shang Dynasty. Tang Chen was the one who founded the Shang Dynasty. Azrai declared war on us. Okay, we are going to leave this. With the Tang Dynasty, what ended up happening, or with the Shang Dynasty, Tang Chen was very much a ruler of peace. The way he ended up taking over from the previous dynasty is the Xia dynasty it'd become corrupt. As with everything, right? Over time, it becomes corrupt. There's issues. And that's kind of where it was heading. And they needed to, honestly, they need to be pushed out of power. So with this said, Tang Qian, in about... Are we talking about Chinese history specifically this time? And then move on to... So I'm going over mainly 3 different legendary figures throughout Eastern Asia. They will not all be from China. They are going to be just throughout Eastern Asia. I will talk on a 4th and a 5th. But I'm giving a little bit of backstory for it. And I'm just going over 100 AD and earlier. So we're just trying to keep it some of the really ancient stuff. The reason we are going to have more Chinese than Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese at this time is the Chinese were the ones who really loved having a lot of records. More than anybody else, they were big on keeping records of things. So, with this being said, the little bit of the backstory with that is the creation of the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven is... What's a good way to explain the Mandate of Heaven? The Mandate of Heaven was a Chinese theory that was from the Shang Dynasty, the second dynasty, and it came from the first Shang Emperor. And his idea was that you start out with a new dynasty, and this continued on into the 1700s, you have a new dynasty come into power, right? You have this new kingdom, and over time, it's going to win wars, it's going to grow, it's going to expand, and it's going to become an old dynasty. And it was the idea that as it becomes older and as it becomes bigger and more powerful, you're going to end up with a corrupt system that's not as efficient. Technology is stagnated. So what the solution to that would be a new dynasty. And he believed that this could, if it was a mandate of heaven, this thing where we started to understand, hey, this is a cycle that happens, we can get it peacefully. Now, he was a vassal state. He was in charge of a vassal state of the Xia dynasty for 17 years. And after 17 years, he did, throughout this time, he created an alliance of 40 other vassal states. These vassal states all fell under the previous dynasty, but what he did was he didn't want them to be violent. He wanted to try and be as peaceful as possible because he thought that would be the best way to rule. So what he did was, over this time, he slowly gained more and more favor with different armies, different vassal states, and ended up creating the new Shang dynasty. Now, of course, no leader is going to give up their power peacefully. So even though they did refuse to immediately give up their power, the previous dynasty was very easily quashed under the weight of so many allied forces fighting them. During this time of expansion, of course, there's also going to be a power vacuum. And one other nation, the Kangwu, tried to take over. Tried to take advantage of it, but were unsuccessful and were fended off. So it was mostly peaceful. One thing I want to talking about him, he's the only other Shang Dynasty person who I'm going to talk about, outside of the warrior woman that I am about to talk about. I want to give him credit. In 1880 AD, Otto von Bismarck created the first government-funded social program and created a social system, the first one. Otto von Bismarck is a great leader. He is not to downplay that. What I would like to point out is there are other great leaders that should be seen as this. Tang, in his first 5 years as the emperor of the dynasty, what he did, and this is a huge thing, there was a massive, what's the word for it? Massive drought. There we go. Brain just could not think of that. During this drought, what he did was he had realized this is a 5-year drought. A lot of families were ending up selling off their children for food, things of the sort. It was a normalized thing back then. Not saying that it's a good thing, but selling your children, even being normalized back then, he did not like this. So what he did was he took gold and he went out to all the poor families under his command, under his kingdom, and he basically went and bought back all of their children for them. Now, this isn't some great charitable thing that's like, oh my god, he's the most charitable man ever. No, there's strategic reasons to do this, of course, but it is something that's not very common, and he does need to be credited with it, in my opinion. That's all I'm saying with that. Brain is having a little brain fart. Real quick, and this is why I have notes. But he had them bought back, and he did. The part where I can go and say, hey, this is a more charitable than usual thing, is the fact that he didn't just buy back the children. He didn't tax them to do this. He also gave them some money so they could buy food so they wouldn't resell their children. Now, this, I think, is technically the first social act of a government of this variety. So that's always a cool thing, is learning that, hey, government not necessarily evil. So that's a really cool thing, and I want to talk about that because that leads to the Shang Dynasty was not the best about keeping records when it comes to Chinese level of keeping records. That being said, records were still heavily kept, and we have a lot of history because of this. Oh, hey! I'll accept that deal. Headshot. My daughter married into your family. Now, I'd like to bring it to the second most famous emperor of the Shang Dynasty, would be Emperor Wu Ding. And a lot of his fame comes from his wife. On top of being a very good and probably one of the last good emperors of the Shang Dynasty, who was, when I say very good, he was very good. He was he was good on a military front. He was also good at taking care of his people. He was remembered as a king of merit. Being this king of merit, there's a lot more information on him. And one of the things he is very famous for is his wife. Now, he had two wives, but we're going to talk about his primary wife, his favorite wife. His favorite wife was Lady Hao, also known as Fu Hao. She lived between 1300 and 1200 BC. This is still during the Bronze Age, but it was during the Bronze Age of tool expansion. So during this time, this is the middle of the Bronze Age, where they're really figuring out how to work with bronze tooling, stuff like that. So the tool, instead of just having very, very simple, maybe a knife that has been filed down, they're wasting a lot of bronze when they're working it, is now they have much better processes, they have much better heat treatments for it, so it can be used for a lot more. During this time, also, specifically during Wu Ding's time as emperor and during Fu Hao's time as empress, three major things were invented. The chariot, the compound bow, and then all of the bronze working techniques I was talking about. Now, I do want to point out, she is so revered during this time that she received basically a special ceremony that normally was only reserved for emperors and kings. Despite her being a queen and her husband was still alive, he specifically had her go through this because she was really, really good at her job. She was an amazing queen. The other queen of Wu Ding, because he only had two, was in charge of millet farming. Millet being similar to a similar grain to rice, and being a large staple outside of rice. But we're not here to talk about her. We're here to talk about Lady Hao. And Lady Hao is we have a lot of information for her because she wasn't just a warrior queen. She was also a great oracle, a high priestess. And on top of being this great oracle and high priestess, she was great at recording information. We have so much information about her because not only did she have other people record information about her, she recorded information about herself and about the things that were going on around her. Um, so as a historian, I have a special love for people like that. She was amazing. She was a full package. Yeah, exactly. She was the full package. So while I'm sitting in this screen for a little bit, we're gonna talk about this. Um, she, with Wu Ding being known as the greatest emperor and her being backing it, there's a lot of great history with her. When we in 1976, this is purely off memory. A lot of this off memory. I have little notes, but most of this off memory. We exhumed her tomb, which was under the Wuxin Temple, which, by the way, he had her tomb separate from the palace. And the reason for this, and this is well recorded, is he didn't want her, he cared more about protecting her from grave robbers than having his other wives and himself protected from grave robbers. So she was super highly regarded by everybody. She was the top general. She led all of the military campaigns. She recorded pretty much all of the political stuff. She is 100% the person you want as a queen. And then on top of it, we do know when we exhumed her body. I do have notes of this. We were found that she had 4 tigers, 6 dogs, and 16 servants, along with over 1,000 pieces of jade and bronze and bone luxury items inside of her tomb. Now, for that time, to have over 1,000 pieces of carved jade, carved bronze, at this time they were way more valuable. It was really rare. For example, a poleaxe, which was one of the main things used for warfare at the time. They didn't use swords; they used poleaxes. Having a bronze poleaxe was the thing that you would have to show you are powerful. That was the thing that was given to military officers only, right? Everybody else would have bone-based ones, maybe stone. You might have a bronze one if you were from a wealthy family, but not an officer, but yours wouldn't be allowed to be decorated. So that would be kind of the things that would be a normalized thing back then. She had one, and she had tons of chariots in her tomb that were her chariots, because the chariot was a brand new thing. She rode a chariot and carried a bronze poleaxe into battle. She was buried with the bronze poleaxe along with tons of other weapons, but mainly that bronze poleaxe that had 2 guardian lions engraved on it fighting each other. You gotta realize this is 3,600 years ago. They were just fighting with stone, like mostly stone weapons. Like, people who had bronze were the great fighters. So to have all of that, have an engraved one, is a crazy thing, right? And then, so yeah, that's what she had, and it's kind of crazy that is what she had, and it's really cool. They have such a big force. That she had such a well designed, and it's been well kept too. Axe. Let's look at my notes real quick on what else was buried with her. And the other thing that was buried with her was a significant amount of bamboo tablets. These are not as legible anymore. It is much harder to read them now, but they are still legible. And a very common thing was they would take oxen, the scapula of an oxen, and carve it for a longer dated, and then stain the inside of the carvings red for a longer dated and more important records. She had tons of those, with signifying the different things of her life. So, as a let's go into the Oracle and Record Keeper. We actually talked about a lot of that. She had two generals under her. These both were men, and there are multiple records from them, along with from the king at the time, her husband, stating how amazing she was. We have her records, and the vast majority of records at the time were actually not the vast majority, but the majority of records were actually from her because she took that many notes. She's very meticulous and explained things very well, to the point where nowadays we look back at it and it is actually remarked that about how her writing is so similar to modern Chinese writing. Whereas like before, a lot of the lines you see in ancient Chinese writing they're very wavy, they're softer lines. The hard lines were starting to come out, and we can now read it. And let's talk about her as a general, because this is what everybody wants to know. This is where the reason I have her pulled out, right? It's not because of the other things. Now I'm just getting to why I actually pulled her out as an example of the type of people I want to talk about. So as a general, she was in charge of the royal forces, both the Wu Shi and the Wo Shi. The Wu Shi were royal male soldiers. The Wo Shi, Wu being for king, and Shi, both Wo Shi and Wu Shi. The Wo Shi are the female soldiers, and the Wu Shi are the male soldiers. Now, it is definitely talked about multiple times the fact that she had both under her command. She had men under her command and also women under her command, and she treated them equally. Now, the men made up her whole thing of archers were purely made of men. And she had women fight. She was one of at this time, most of the world did not have professional soldiers. China was an exception to this. So these aren't just, these are conscripted women from just a random village because we need soldiers. No, these are professional soldiers. That's what they do. And that's really freaking cool, is these women professional soldiers out here to fight. Now, the women's professional soldiers most likely would have been equipped with spears, poleaxes, and dagger axes. Both her soldiers were equipped with bone and bronze weapons, and the men would have been equipped with bows, spears, poleaxes, and dagger axes. Those were the weapons at the time. Also was the beginning of the use of chariots. So up until then, chariots weren't a thing, and so now you're having it's unlike you see in fantasy movies. Women do not fight with bows. There's almost no record of that in history. It's actually kind of a ridiculous idea once you start thinking about it, because a bow for war is going to take about 100 pounds to pull back. That is a lot of freaking weight, and takes a lot of strength. And to be honest, women just don't have that strength, but that's okay, because you can have well-trained women still fight. They just aren't going to be archers. But so yeah, no, in history, more likely and more common would have been warrior women with axes, spears, things like that. Even swords, it would have been just significantly more common. Let me focus for a second here. My men can take care of everything else. Yeah, there's a lot of depictions of it, but it's one of those things that it would have been very rare, especially European bows. European bows were much, much harder to draw. Like, and when people don't understand, a 100-pound bow, you can have somebody who is a gym rat nowadays, who's very strong, they're going to struggle to pull a 100-pound bow. Like, it isn't like, oh, I'm pulling 100 pounds. It is very different. And yes, these people would have been more focused on that muscle group, but it's still very hard, and it's a lot of work to pull that bow. Most of your gym bros today would not be able to do it. Like, that's not an exaggeration at all. That's just how it is. It's a very hard thing to do. Yeah, there might have been some. It's always a possibility, right? There's always going to be the exception to the rule. You also have to realize, well, not when it comes to Europe, but when it comes to Asia, the lines between man, woman, LGBT, stuff like that, were a lot more blurred. China was not a anti-LGBT place until communism came in. So another thing we can thank the communists for is the hate of the LGBT in Asia, along with the oppression of women. Yeah, exactly. It is the tips of your fingers that you are pulling that with, and not only that, the arm strength of pulling them apart with your arms while aiming. Yeah, you're not holding it for a long time, but you are actively pulling that. It's a very, very hard thing to do. Archers, move! Yeah, exactly. 100-pound bow, and that's the thing. 100-pound bow is not your heaviest when it comes to war bows. War bows, you'll get stuff that's in the freaking 150 sometimes. And that is so much freaking weight. To anybody who has done archery, they would realize 150-pound draw weight would be insane. Yeah, and even modern composite bows are hard to draw. And they specifically are designed to make it much easier. At the time, also, horse archery wasn't really a thing, or not, sorry, horse archery. Chariot archery wasn't really a thing, and instead it was chariots where they'd you'd have axes and spears on your chariots. Her chariot, for example, which would have been of a more common design at the time, except for hers had bronze shielding on it, was made of bamboo and drawn by two horses, and only had room for one person. So chariots at the time were more used for command posts, like mobile command. But it was also much easier to fight from a chariot than it is to fight off horseback. Another really cool thing about her chariot is we actually have found arrowheads lodged into the front of some of her chariots, meaning she wasn't out there just going and commanding from behind. No, she was out there actually fighting, taking command, and being a good general. Like, most generals would not be willing to do that, especially nowadays. But even back then, it wasn't a thing that all generals did. So she was a fucking badass. But on top of being a great general, she was also known as an amazing negotiator. There are multiple cases of attempted rebellions, while or when she did have to conscript, there are a lot of cases of not just rebellions, but of just refusal to have men go and have the men conscripts go out and be conscripted. We know of one case where the men weren't allowed to be conscripted because they needed to work the fields, and instead the village allowed the women to be conscripted into her army. So that is one thing she was also known for. She was a great negotiator. She was able to negotiate that instead of, hey, we're just going to say, well, boo-hoo, I'm going to kill you all. No, she negotiated it back into having a good solution for the problem. Right? Which is very important. A leader needs to be able to negotiate. Now, I would assume if she was in charge of negotiations like this, she probably was also in charge of negotiations on higher levels with other nations and things like that. This would just be a reasonable, right? That's just a reasonable jump. So she's also credited. Actually, let's talk about the wars that she won and fought in. In 1211 to 1214, she conquered. And this is 1214 to 1211 BC. I flipped the numbers because this is BC. The numbers kind of go backwards. It's a little bit annoying. It's hard to remember sometimes. There, the Guifang chiefdom, which yes, it's a chiefdom, does not mean they didn't have a full army. Who had been never on friendly terms with the Shang dynasty, ended up declaring war. And so she was in charge of that war front. During that war that to the north of the Shang dynasty, which lasted 3 years, she would become credited with one of the first large-scale ambushes in history and the first Chinese large-scale ambush in history. I think actually it might be the first large-scale ambush in history of that size, where she was able to create an ambush with 13,000 men under command. Now, I want to explain there's no, you got to remember, this is a time where if you wanted a message to go to somebody, you needed to send a horseman there. They needed to send a horseman back to tell you they got that message, and then you'd send a horseman, you'd send one back, so then they got the message that you got the message. That's how things worked. It is so during that time, which that is the standard practice of getting messages, you have to send one to get sent back and then come back. That was the standard practice for that, which is an insane thing to think about because that's just really hard to do. And you'd have to change the horsemen, right? Because you can't have that one dude riding out and then on his horse and then he rides back a lot of the time. A lot of the time you have to have them have different horsemen switch out to send these notes because they are riding full steam to get these messages across as quickly as possible. So to organize 13,000 people to create an effective ambush like that is very, very hard, and it would take a great strategic mind and a great general. So that ambush that she laid in 1211 BC would actually lead to the end of that war, and she would be the one who is credited with winning that war, as she should be. That is not an easy thing. That would be actually even like that itself was the last battle of that war. After that, Da Peng, in 11 years later, in 1200 BC, she led the annexation of Da Peng when the vassal state of Da Peng tried to separate. So they no longer wanted to be a vassal state. They tried to separate. She would lead to the annexation, and they would no longer be a vassal state, but they would be an annexed nation.
I'd wish you.
Now, the reason this is a big thing, because you think vassal state, they're much weaker. Um, they wouldn't have a lot of things. The thing about Da Ping was one of their main suppliers of of rare woods, and also on top of rare woods, military goods and pearls. So they were the ones providing the bronze weaponry. And so you're fighting against a force who is the ones who make your own weapons. It's a very important force to take over. And it's a very hard one, right? They have a lot of advantages against you. She would leave this, and end up basically she executed the lords that betrayed them, and she would end up annexing it along with her two lead generals. One thing she was known for is she was known for her cruelty, as far as when it came to warfare, right? She wasn't known for being cruel when it came to leadership, but when it came to warfare, she was known for executing her enemies. And she did not take prisoners. Which, when you're known for that, that means less people are going to surrender to you. It also means less people are going to rebel. There's benefits there's benefits of it, but also there are negatives to it. So I don't agree with necessarily not doing it, but at the time it might have been the best decision. I don't know what the full politics were of the time, right? Nobody ever will at this point, unless we create a time machine. But she was a fucking badass. But being as long ago as it is, we don't have any more real information about her. We know that she was seen as a warrior herself, so she not only would execute the people herself, she would organize the executions, but she'd also fight. She is buried in armor, and her the servants that were there buried with her, some of them were soldiers. So she was respected among the soldiers, which you don't get respected by soldiers unless you can fight yourself. Like, a soldier isn't really going to respect a statesman all that much if they don't fight. And she was able to consistently fight. And leading 13,000 men is not an easy feat, right? And I say men, talking about men and women, because she had a force of both. But this was professional soldiers. So even when they're not at war, that's what these men and women did. With the exception of a small amount of conscripts, but the majority of her army were these men and women who that's what their career was. They were career fighters, and they respected her enough to stay career fighters under her. The next little group of people I'd like to talk about, and I say group because there's two of them. The next one is the from northern Vietnam, what is now northern Vietnam, what at the time would have been called the Red Delta, or Red River Delta. And the people were known as the Lac Viet. Now, the Lac Viet were they were a roaming, they were nomadic roaming people who were under the rule of the Han Dynasty, I believe, right? Yes, the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty being one of the greatest dynasties of China. But at the same time, the Han Dynasty, as much as it was a great dynasty, did have some lords who weren't the best. The Han Dynasty lasted as long as it could because it was known for specifically trying to prevent China from having lords who were going to cause problems. Like overly cruel, greedy, tyrannical was avoided. But it still did sometimes happen. Now, the Trung sisters are a case of two sisters who came out of one of these times where, hey, it just so happened there was depending on the record, there was, if you go to Vietnamese records for this, because the Vietnamese took records very well. So specifically the Lac Viet, despite being farmers, specifically bronze drum makers and dike engineers, dikes being the water, basically trenches for water to prevent flooding and also to control water for better irrigation. That's what they were. They also were pretty good at taking record and keeping track of what was going on. The Han had mostly tried to bring in good things. One of the big things the Han brought in was women's rights, specifically in political and economic power. So the schooling system, better agricultural techniques, Confucianism, Taoism, and also they did enforce the Chinese language, which is not always a good idea to enforce things like language. In fact, I would say you don't want to enforce things like language, but they did. That being said, they did try and bring better things to the area. And occasionally you would end up having people like Governor Su Ding in this case. Governor Su Ding was very cruel and greedy. According to the Vietnamese records, he was a dictator or like a tyrannical and truly evil man, on top of being greedy. A good example of this would be what ended up happening with this was, and also, even in Chinese records, he is regarded as not just greedy, but a coward. So Chinese records do agree that he was not a good person. Like, the Chinese records are up against this guy too. Despite him being a Chinese governor, even the other governors at the time did regard him as being greedy, being a coward. So this is not just like a one-sided, well, this person said one thing, this person said the other. Now, what ended up leading to this was the two sisters, the Trung sisters, being Trung Trec and Trung Ni, were born to very rich, noble families. They had a lot of money. And their land was under Su Ding's command. Now, Su Ding, being a greedy person, ended up basically causing a lot of problems. One of those problems is he actually executed Trek's husband, Trung Trec, without a trial. And that was a really big deal, because if he was executed with a trial and he was found guilty, even at the time, it would have been a much less. Like, yes, it would have been, oh, you still executed my husband, but it would have been a much, it would have been as bad, right? It wouldn't have been as easy to go, hey, this guy's a cruel tyrant, he's horrible. So, what happened with that? He got executed and beheaded without trial. This would end up in a 3-year rebellion that was defeated. The Trung sisters, their rebellion was not successful. But they are of note because of how strong and how powerful their rebellion was. Now, it only lasted 3 years. It happened in 40 AD and ended by 43 AD. During this time, they would get together a lot of the people who were under Su Ding's command, like where he governed, right? And they gathered all these people. These are not professional soldiers. These are thousands of conscripted soldiers. So first off, you have to convince them to fight. They aren't fighters. You got to arm them. And all of this, despite doing all this, right? All these hardships and hard things that you'd be required to do, she was able to, in the first 2 years, take over 65 Chinese strongholds. 65 in 2 years. That is an insane amount, especially when you're talking about you're using non-professional soldiers and you are going up against China, who had professional soldiers. So you have a huge weakness here. And she's still, like, these two, I say they, because there's two of them, these two sisters were able to get together enough people, get them trained up enough to fight, arm them enough to go and take over 65 strongholds in 2 years. To explain, that's a new stronghold every 2 weeks, right? If I'm doing my math right, it's a new stronghold every, like, week and a half, 2 weeks. That's math off top of my head. Don't quote me on that one. But that's very impressive. The sisters would ride an elephant together and commanded from an elephant. They commanded forces of many different vassal states, many different tribes, who all came together to fight together, despite none of them being trained warriors or anything like that. So that is a very commendable thing. It is a very impressive thing, too. So the way that this rebellion was defeated is Ma Yuan, one of the top Chinese generals of the time, had been ordered to march after his previous campaign, because he had just gotten off another campaign where he fought. So his men are not only professional soldiers, but they're veterans. They're well-trained, they're well-armed veterans going up against a conscript force. There is no chance the conscript force is winning. But despite this, it still took him a full year, or not a full year, but almost a full year. It was just under a full year to still take back that territory with all those advantages. That is an insane, like, feat on his end, but also it is insane that they were able to take with it. It just goes to show you they took over what would take professional soldiers about half the time. And that doesn't sound great until you realize what ended up happening in the major battle. In the major battle, what ended up happening was all these conscripted soldiers that fought under these sisters ended up basically surrendering. Within the first 1,000 of those conscripted soldiers killed, they almost immediately surrendered, with about 10,000 of them surrendering and more fleeing. So I gotta say, that's what it took, and should show how impressive those two sisters taking over that land was. During this battle, according to the Chinese, these women fell honorably in battle. So that's another big thing. The Chinese respected them enough to say, hey, they fell honorably in battle. According to Vietnamese records, these two sisters committed suicide. Now, Chinese are very, very reliable record holders when it comes to wars. I personally am going to... But the records held by the Vietnamese don't want to admit that the Chinese killed them, which I understand why they would do that. The other big change between it was... No, I already covered that. Was that Su Ding was a greedy asshole. And the reason he was a coward, that he's regarded by everybody as a coward, is he didn't stand and fight them. Once his army was defeated, he fled. Whereas at the time, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, people would agree to die with their soldiers. They would fight to they'd fight to the end, maybe be kept prisoner. The next one I want to talk about would be Mother Lu. Mother Lu is a Chinese, is going back to the Chinese. Mother Lu is a very brief one. Not a lot is known about her because she is a lower official. And it was a short-lived period. Mother Lu was the first rebel leader in China. And she is noted for, after the first time the Han Dynasty split into the West and East Han Dynasty, what she did was she ended up going and taking, what's a good way to put this? So she was born under the Eastern Han Dynasty, which would end up falling during her lifetime in about 9 AD and becoming the Xia dynasty, the shortest lived dynasty not the Xia, the Xin dynasty, which is the shortest lived dynasty because of her. Her actions had turned that into the shortest lived dynasty, though she would not end up being able to see it for herself. I would personally credit her with a big portion of being the reason why the Xia dynasty or Xin dynasty just would not be in power for very long. Now, what had happened with this was her son was executed over what is considered a minor offense by the government, by a greedy governor. Hey, Cordy, I'm just going over history right now. We're coming towards the end of it. We're talking about Mother Lu right now, the first female rebel leader in China, where her family was stupid rich, but they're still low officials. Because of greed and jealousy, her son was executed for what was a very minor crime at the time. Like, it wouldn't have been something that normally somebody would have been executed over. So, when she was executed, Why is this acting like it's acting weird? When her son was executed, basically she went from village to village as a low-born noble, recruiting a peasant army to start a rebellion. Now, this peasant army would go and march on the capital itself, and she would die during this fight. But what the big thing is about this is, one, she was the first one to do it. Two, she led thousands of peasants. These thousands of peasants would go from her leading them. And when I say leading, she was executed on her son's tomb. She was beheaded on her son's tomb as to represent it, because she marched the steps herself. She led her army of peasants. This army of peasants would then go to join the Red Eyebrow. Yes, the Red Eyebrow Rebellion, which was the noble portion of the rebellion who weren't actually doing any fighting at the time, but they were ready to rebel. This was the professional army now that didn't have the numbers to actually fight. She gave them the numbers to fight, and 5 years later, the Shin dynasty would fall. 5 years after her death. But if she didn't do this, the Shin dynasty would never have had the force to make it collapse. This rebellion would then allow the Western Han dynasty to recreate the Han dynasty as a singular whole Han dynasty. So she is a very important figure in Chinese history because of this. Even if she didn't get to see the rebellion end herself, if she wasn't able to win it and wasn't able to run it as the head and become the champion of it and all this, she was still able to get it to the point where that ended up happening. Which is always an important thing. Another big thing that's with that, of course, would be the fact that if she never did that, it never would have happened. It never would have worked, right? The last one I actually forgot to take notes on. So this one's not going to be as well done. I just didn't have the time. I spent hours studying today. So we are going to talk about specifically Yuan Nu. And I'll briefly touch on after this Fa Mulan, though we do not know what age or from what time Fa Mulan was from. Yuan Nu was a swordswoman of the state of Yu, one of the first, not only one of the first great swordswomen, she is the author of the earliest known exposition on swordplay. So, and this is specifically, she was born in 496 BC and died in 465. So, this is a huge thing. Women are not always seen in swordsmanship. You see them often portrayed with bows in history. But the first person to ever write a exposition on swordsmanship and how to be a swordsman and swordplay is actually a woman. She is known for writing some great literature. And this is right after the this is about 600 years before the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a huge part of Chinese history. I will do its own thing for that. That is the Romance of the Chinese Kingdoms Romance of the Three Kingdoms would take me hours to even do a brief overview of. But um, she was a master of archer and also a master of swordsmanship, in which it is noted she used swordsmanship to fucking hunt. She hunted with a sword. That is fucking badass.
Under my orders, soldiers! Move! Attack! Whoa! Infantry, charge!
She was also a great poet. So you're talking about one of the first. Actually, sorry, not. I keep wanting to say one of the first because it's such an instinctual thing to say in history. No, she is the first person to write an exposition on swordsplay, and on top of it was a great poet and a hunter. Like, she was invited by the king of China at the time, which I believe this would have also been during the Han Dynasty. Sorry, it is not the king of China. It was the king of Yue, which is not a part of China at this time. So she was also known for giving demonstrations for the king, and yeah, it's just really impressive. She is known basically because of her skills. She was immediately given the title known as the Lady of Yue, and the king appointed her to train all of the army officers in martial arts. She is known to be one of the founders of Chinese martial arts, and she was believed to have perfect yin and yang energy, having a great calm and a great spirit on top of being this great swordsman. She was a master of Taoism, and her followers would end up actually becoming such as Yuan Gong, was one of the followers of Taoism. And sorry, I'm reading through this a little bit. So Yuan Gong was believed to be, which one of her followers and one of the people she trained was believed to be the reincarnation of the Monkey King. So she wasn't just a good swordsman, wasn't just a good poet, wasn't just a good author. She was also a good teacher. And so there's a lot of mythology around her because she is great at what she did. And that's also really freaking important, right? She did many great things and was able to command forces. Though we don't know too much about her. She's not as well kept track of as I wish. But at the same time, still well tracked, right? Let's see if I can get this guy. Keep him pushed into my territory. But those are the ones I was going to go over. I wish I could have given a better one for the lady.
It's been a while.
For one of the greatest swordsmen in history, as far as her really creating Chinese martial arts, and being one of the first authors of any sort of books on swordplay, being so great to where the king went and took you and just immediately went, yep, you're training all of my officers.
Um,
But yeah. Those are that was my pre-100 AD woman of ancient ancient Asia, really. Ancient Eastern Asia. Those are my picks of some of the most noteworthy that I feel like need to be talked about. And some of them, yeah, you got to realize it's a long time ago. We don't have tons of information about them. That's why I started with the one we had the most information on. But yeah, we're going to be missing some information on some of them, and that's okay.